Hey friends, it is a hot August day. The sun is shining really bright. Thankfully the garden up there is in the shade, and we are going to plant some fall crops, which is really exciting. Sometimes hard to think about whenever it's so hot outside and you're overwhelmed with tomatoes and zucchini and stuff like that, but the fall garden is coming quickly, and so we're going to start planning for that. Now, when planning a fall garden, there are a couple of things to think about before you get started, and one of the biggest things to think about and to know is when your first average frost date is. You can simply find this by Googling first average frost date and your zip code, and that will give you a good idea of when the first average frost is for your area. That also gives you a good idea of how many days of frost-free growing that you have left over. Now, whenever I'm planting a fall garden, I typically try to plant things that are frost hardy, which means that usually that first average frost date doesn't really affect them very much. They can take a couple of light frosts and still continue to grow just fine. They will eventually die after a really hard freeze and it stays really consistently cold and frozen. Those things will eventually die as well. But when planting your fall garden, you want to know when that first average frost date is, because that can give you a good idea of how many days you have left in your typical growing season. Now, I just Googled our first average frost date here where I garden in Zone 6B in Pennsylvania, and I did that by putting in my zip code, and it says that our first average frost date is in October, around October 13th. Now, that does not mean that you will get a frost on October 13th. That just means that around that time you can start to expect some freezing temperatures coming your way. Now, typically that does not mean a hard killing frost or killing freeze, which is below 24 degrees. It usually means somewhere between 32 and 28 degrees, something like that. Like I mentioned earlier though, if you take into account some of your crops that you're growing and the fact that some of them can actually be frost hardy, that those cooler temperatures won't affect them, won't kill them. They'll be able to continue growing for a couple weeks after that. Now, since my first average frost date here in Pennsylvania is around October 13th, that means that I still have about 80 days left in my growing zone. So anything that is shorter than an 80-day maturity will still grow during this time. So whenever you get a seed packet or even some started plants, the little plant tags that you have, they will say how many days to maturity that you have to get a harvest from these crops. So these beets here are a 30-day maturity. I have plenty of time to grow these in my 80 days left. So we're going to be planting these today. As it starts to get cooler though, you kind of want to give yourself a little bit of a buffer. So if you were trying to plant something that needed a full 80 days to grow, that is a little bit of a gamble, because as the days get colder and shorter, sometimes the plants don't grow quite as fast and they need like another extra week or so to really make it to maturity, just because, like I said, the days are getting shorter and it's getting cooler outside. Now, some really safe things to plant for a fall garden would be things like brassicas and leafy greens. So broccoli, cabbages, cauliflower, kale, Swiss chard, any root vegetables such as beets, radishes, carrots, anything like that. Those are all really a safe way to go whenever you're planting a fall garden, if you're kind of hugging the line of it getting too close to the end of your season, because those types of crops actually do better in the cooler temperatures. And like I mentioned earlier, those are crops that can handle some of the freeze. So a light freeze is not going to harm them at all. They're going to just continue to grow for you and do really well. So today I'm going to be planting some French breakfast radishes, some spinach, some carrots, and two types of lettuce. I have a green romaine lettuce and a red romaine lettuce that I grow all the time. If you guys have ever watched me plant lettuce before, it's the same kind of lettuce. I plant the same kind of lettuce all the time. I like it. I get it from Eden Brothers. I'll link them down below if you guys have never ordered seeds from them. They're a really good seed place. I also love Johnny's Seeds. They're a wonderful seed place, so if you're looking for seeds. I also really, honestly, I pick up seeds wherever I go. I am not a seed snob, shall we say. I can't help but pick up packets of seeds, whether I'm at Walmart or Tractor Supply or any random store that has seeds. If something looks interesting to me, I will usually pick it up. It doesn't matter to me. So yeah, but those are just two of my favorite places to order seeds online. So let's talk a little bit about the soil in my raised beds and how I prepped it to start my fall crops after growing in it for most of the season so far, after spring and summer crops have been in this bed. So right here is our cabbage bed. Last video I gave you guys a little bit of a tour of the garden, and since then we have completely cleaned out this bed. There was some kale and some broccoli in this bed, and I thought I would leave the kale in here, but really it wasn't looking that great, and I just harvested the rest of it and pulled it out. We have some other kale in some other spots, so I thought it'd be nice just to start fresh with this bed. So what I did was I took some compost that we actually make ourselves here, and I just put a good layer of compost on top of the other soil that we had in this bed. I like to make sure that whenever I'm putting compost on top of my garden beds that there are lots of activity in the compost, shall we say. Lots of earthworms, lots of other critters and creatures, lots of diversity going on in the soil that I'm putting on here, or the compost that I'm putting on here. Some of you may notice that there are still some leaves, there's some small sticks, things like that that haven't fully composted down yet, and typically I don't have any issue with that. That's all totally fine with me. It's all brown matter at this point, and most of it's composted. There's just a few sticks and things left in it. So after we put a layer of compost down, I took my pitchfork, and instead of like tilling up the soil, what I like to do is just stick my tines of my pitchfork down into the soil and just kind of lift up the soil and then pull my tines out and just do that all over the bed. What I find that does is it just kind of aerates the soil. It breaks out the compaction a little bit, because sometimes your soil can get compacted and hard. So it just helps to aerate the soil, get some of that compost down into the layers of soil a little bit without really disrupting the natural layers of soil, because we've been finding out more and more with the no-till methods that disrupting the layers of the soil composition is really not that great for it. So we're trying to not really disturb those layers so much as we are just trying to get some nutrients, some air, some water, you know, and just kind of loosen up that soil a little bit to really accept what we're adding to it and not be so compacted. So that's what I do with all of my garden beds. Every time I'm ready to plant something new in it, I just aerate it a little bit with my pitchfork. I add new compost to it. Sometimes I'll add Biotone starter fertilizer or plant tone or something like that into the soil. I don't have any of that on hand right now, so I just use my compost that I have. Some of my other beds are going to need some compost soon, and I'm running low on the compost that I created, so I might have to get creative, maybe buy some compost, whatever. But I always want to make sure that I recharge my soil. One of the biggest things that you want to think about when you are growing in your garden is not feeding the plants that you're growing, but feeding the soil. Because if you have healthy soil, if you have strong soil, your plants are going to do amazing. But if you have horrible soil and you're only feeding those plants, it's not a good long-term solution whatsoever. You might have some healthy plants, but your soil is just going to be terrible, which means your plants won't then be nutrient rich and diverse, which is something we want in our food. We want our foods to be full of nutrition. That's one of the reasons that we grow our food at home, is because we want it to be nutritious and good for us and everything. And if your soil doesn't have what it needs and you're only feeding your plants and not feeding your soil, that can be a big problem of not having nutrient-dense foods. So anyway, after saying all that, let's go ahead and get some things planted. I think I'm going to plant pretty much everything in this one bed. I have another bed over there, but it's not ready to be planted in yet, so I think we're just going to try to put everything in this bed. It should all fit. To plant our things today, I typically like to just do rows of things, especially lettuces, carrots, things like that. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm just going to take my hand and I'm going to make a row in my soil here. Now you can see how fluffy my soil is, and like I said, that's because I aerated it with my pitchfork. I didn't turn it over at all. I simply just aerated it, and I am able to just use my hand to make a nice little trench here in our soil. I'm going to plant one row of carrots here in the front. So I'm just going to take my carrot seeds and sprinkle them along this row. I'm really not super picky whenever I'm planting seeds. I tend to just dump them in rows like this, cover them over with just a little bit of soil, and then I will come out and thin my seedlings later if they're too close together. Another thing that I like to do is I like to spread my crops out. So I'll do like a row of carrots here in this bed, and then I'll go to a different bed and plant another row of carrots somewhere else in the garden. I find that that really helps with pest prevention and all kinds of stuff because you just have your stuff spread throughout the garden. This next row, we're going to plant our spinach. Same thing as the carrots, we're just going to sprinkle our seeds along the row here and then cover it over. Okay, so really not much to see at all right now. I left my seed packets lay where I planted each thing so that I can come back up here with some plant tags and write them and mark exactly where everything is planted. But as you can see, we still have a little less than half the bed yet that we can plant, and I might just use that to succession sow some more lettuce and things like that. But that's really all there is to it. Sometimes I think we think that gardening is just like super complicated or super difficult, but I just planted a ton of food in about 5 minutes maybe. And yeah, it's really simple. It's really awesome. I love showing people how to garden and hopefully inspiring people to try to garden. It's not 100% success rate. Trust me, there's things that I do and I'm like, there's no reason this should have failed, and yet it did. But I think because it's not super difficult and seeds aren't super expensive, just keep trying. Don't give up. Sometimes there's things that happen, but it's worth it. It's worth it to keep trying. It's worth it to try again the next year. It's worth it to throw some seeds in the ground and see what happens. And that's one of the reasons that I love gardening so much. It's easy to try. Like I said, it doesn't always work out, and sometimes that's frustrating. But we can try. And we can try again next year. We can try again in the fall or in the spring or whatever it is. There's always next year. There's always another time to try it again. And there's always redemption in the garden. Well, I hope this video was helpful. I hope I inspired you guys to go out and plant a fall garden. Have you ever planted a fall garden before? Is this your first year? Let me know in the comment section below. I would love to hear from you guys. And what are some of your favorite fall crops to grow? Let me know. If you plant a fall garden and you have something that you love to grow that I didn't mention, go ahead and put it in the comment section below. I'd love to hear it. Also, I would love for you guys to comment where you are from and your growing zone. I know that some places across the pond don't really have growing zones, but if you give us like your general area, that would be really cool. I'd love to know where you guys are gardening at and what your climate is like maybe. That would be really fun. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. We will see you in the next one.